Take a moment to guess how old this skyscraper on Collins Street is. This here is 333 Collins Street, and can you believe it was built in 1990? I'd forgive you if you thought it was older like I did, but head inside and you'll find something that dates way further back, and it's the reason the skyscraper looks the way it does. If you're new here, hello! I'm Ken and I make videos about history, infrastructure, architecture and the environment. Thanks for joining me. Today, I'm exploring 333 Collins Street, the historic banking chamber that now forms its lobby, and the potential curse that hit it twice. Back in 1866, the Commercial Bank of Australia first opened its headquarters here, right in what was the heart of Melbourne's financial district. This site remained the bank's headquarters for its entire 116-year existence. By the 1880s, the bank had become one of the fastest growing in Australia, but its headquarters was being outshined by newer, grander neighbours along Collins Street. So, to celebrate the success of the bank, and maybe to show off a little bit, the directors decided to commission an extraordinary new building for the same site. In 1890, they did the regular thing and held a competition. The competition was jointly won by architects Lloyd Taylor, who designed the dome and the facade, and Alfred Dunn, who designed the offices, which now no longer exist. Fun fact, if you watched my last video about the Royal Exhibition Building, Lloyd Taylor's design actually came second in that design competition. Construction began in 1891 and the building opened in 1893. At the centre of the design was this incredible banking chamber. It's an octagonal space around 20 metres across, crowned by a 30-metre tall dome. Natural light once streamed unobstructed through the lantern above, illuminating the interior and highlighting the floral motifs on the mosaic floor and the timber used in the furniture. The architecture was inspired by Italian Renaissance and Baroque design. It's very symmetrical with lots of arches and support columns, which are all decorated beautifully. But the timing to build their new headquarters couldn't have been worse. Melbourne was the epicentre of Australia's 1880s speculative building boom. It was a very optimistic climate with few legal restrictions on the operations of banks. In fact, it wasn't just banks that were lending money. Building societies were popping up everywhere and built themselves grand office buildings. Lending was extravagant and banks and building societies failed to properly review property developments before lending to them. This all came back to bite in the 1890s when the bubble burst. A major banking collapse and economic depression followed. On the 5th of April 1893, only a few months after opening its new headquarters, the Commercial Bank of Australia was liquidated for the purpose of reconstruction. Within 6 weeks of the bank suspending its operations, 13 of Australia's 22 other trading banks also suspended their operations. It was really bad. The bank came very close to total collapse. It was one of the lucky ones undergoing a reconstruction process where it formed a new legal entity with the same name. It was able to reopen later that year. Fast forward to the 1970s and this building was faced with a different kind of threat: demolition. In the few years leading up to 1969, the bank decided it needed new, modern headquarters and started acquiring additional properties around the banking chamber in preparation for development. The bank appointed consultants to do a feasibility study on whether it was possible to retain the banking chamber. In 1970, the consultants said it was impractical, and in 1972, they started the administrative process to build a completely new building without incorporating the chamber. By January 1973, the National Trust of Australia caught wind of this plan and announced the classification of the chamber in an effort to preserve it. In July that year, the National Trust issued a special edition of its newsletter titled CBA Banking Chamber Melbourne to be demolished. The National Trust says it can and must be saved. The Trust encouraged supporters to sign petitions objecting to the proposal, and the response was strong. In a 3-week period, it had gathered the support of more than 150,000 people. The Australian Building Construction Employees and Builders Labourers Federation lent its support to the campaign by placing a black ban on any demolition of the building. The matter was eventually raised in Parliament, and both the bank and the Trust discussed the situation with the Premier. As a result of the Trust campaign, Premier Rupert Hamer announced a committee of inquiry in October 1973 to investigate the feasibility of retaining the banking chamber. To the relief of supporters, the inquiry recommended that the banking chamber be kept. So, the banking chamber was saved, but this wasn't all the drama it would see in its lifetime. You know how at the start of the video I said this building might have been hit by a curse? Well, that's because the 1890s crash wasn't the only financial disaster to hit it. By the 1980s, the bank itself had changed. After merging with the Bank of New South Wales, it became Westpac, and the old headquarters was no longer needed. In 1987, Melbourne was in the midst of another property boom, and the bank knew if they decided to sell, they'll win big. So big, in fact, that the site at 333 Collins Street sold for the largest land price in Melbourne's history, $106.6 million, equivalent to around $355.3 million today. It was sold to a partnership between developer Beckton Group and Tricontinental Merchant Bank. The Australian Financial Review reported that Beckton planned to incorporate the chamber in the most technologically advanced skyscraper in Australia. To help Beckton and Tricontinental, Westpac put together a smart funding package that overcame the need for an anchor tenant in a new skyscraper. Under this deal, Tricontinental was to provide $200 million on completion of the building. But the arrangement was complex, so as an extra safeguard, if Tricontinental didn't pay up, South Australia's State Government Insurance Commission, the SGIC, agreed to buy the whole building for $520 million. Things went horribly wrong in the recession of 1990 in a cruel repeat of history. The Reserve Bank of Australia needed to increase interest rates in 1989, which brought on a deep recession in the 90s. Beckton ended up exercising 90% of its option with the SGIC, seeking $512 million. However, the SGIC hadn't adequately covered its own position and itself went completely broke. The Premier of South Australia, John Bannon, was forced to resign in 1992, and as a result, the Labor government was overthrown in South Australia. Tricontinental was in a much worse position. To understand what went wrong, we need to take a quick aside. During the 1980s property boom, Tricontinental aggressively expanded their lending. Its loan book exploded from around $1.3 billion to over $2 billion in a year, far exceeding internal safeguards. Many of these loans went to high-risk property developers and speculative projects. The extent of this recklessness was not known by the Victorian government-owned State Bank of Victoria, which bought a 25% stake in Tricontinental in 1978, and then, kind of tragically, full ownership of Tricontinental in 1985, only a few short years before the 1990 recession. You might be wondering why the heck the State Bank of Victoria made this decision. Well, at this time in history, the state banks were trying to compete with private and international banks, and this acquisition looked decent on paper and was part of the state bank's own aggressive expansion strategy. Okay, so back to the 1990 recession. When it hit, Tricontinental completely collapsed, bringing the State Bank of Victoria down with it, and triggering a financial crisis across the state. It is estimated Tricontinental caused losses of upwards of $1.5 billion. The state government was forced to sell the state bank to the Commonwealth Bank for $2 billion, but still lost Victorian taxpayers between $40 to $75 million. A royal commission followed, and the fallout was a key factor in the 1992 defeat of Joan Kirner's Labour government and the election of Jeff Kennett's Liberal government. And yet, despite all of that, 333 Collins was completed. The skyscraper was designed by Nelson Architects International and Robert Peck von Hartel-Thorothoen. Apparently, its design was the result of a huge amount of effort by Paul Jerome, the former head of the planning department, and architect Bruce Thorothoen in convincing the owners of the site to restore and reflect the banking chamber in the new building. At a cost of $600 million, this 33-story tower rose above Collins Street, incorporating the banking chamber as its new lobby. It's an example of American postmodern classicism, and to me it invokes images of New York skyscrapers. The building is set back from both Flinders Street and Collins Street, something I wish more modern buildings did, and its height is limited to prevent overshadowing the Yarra. In honouring the banking chamber, the original facade was replicated in a more postmodern style. The original facade changed long before the skyscraper was built in 1939. The original 5-story ornate facade was considered unattractive, so it was demolished to apparently no public protest and redesigned as an 8-story structure in a much more restrained style. At the street level, there are some really cool touches, like these large light fittings which echo the shape of the tower and the original cast iron gates from the banking chamber. It seems no expense was spared in the restoration of the chamber or the finishes used throughout the skyscraper, with granite covering the building and 2 copper domes crowning it. Earlier, I mentioned that the building was built without an anchor tenant. It was actually around 65% empty when it opened. The developers decided when it opened in 1990 to call it Collins Exchange with the expectation that the Stock Exchange of Melbourne would move there. But this never happened. And housing $5 million worth of telecommunications infrastructure for Telecom Australia, later Telstra, the skyscraper was plagued by leasing issues in its early years. Of course, these days it is a much sought-after address for its uniqueness. The banking chamber is able to be visited during business hours, and I highly recommend it. If you happen to visit in December, you'll be blessed by a giant Christmas tree in the center of the lobby. 333 Collins Street is a great example of how a city can grow without erasing its past. Instead of replacing a historic building, the new skyscraper was designed to marry the old with the new. Though of course this was only possible with the tireless efforts of people who knew the significance of the banking chamber and fought for it. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, the resources I used to research this video are linked in the description. If you'd like to support the channel and help me keep making videos like this, there's a link below where you can buy me a coffee. Please also consider giving it a like or subscribing to my channel to see more of our iconic Melbourne. I recently did videos on the Royal Exhibition Building and the Rialto which you might enjoy. See you in the next one.